Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of sHreadLines. Today we're going to be taking a look at the situation over in Greece and see if we can wrap our heads around it because this is a weird one. Let's jump right in, shall we? So back in the 1980s, things were going pretty well for Greece. It was credit binge central, according to many sources in the media, and back then the country's two major political parties were essentially passing power back and forth and leading pretty cushy government lives in the process. So, after a while, it did make Greece a pretty costly place to do business. A lot of the tax revenue did come from, well, basically billing companies to, well, have their businesses there. So a lot of times people would just take their companies elsewhere. So this left Greece in a fairly dependent situation upon outside help. So once the euro arrived back in 2001, things were looking pretty swell, and it was celebrations in the streets once again. And after the most recent vote of no, as we've seen from some of the pictures coming out on social media, it seems to be pretty celebratory over there at the moment. That, unfortunately, may be a little bit short-lived, as these guys are not out of the woods yet. The European Union had a major incentive to get as many new members into the EU as possible in order to strengthen its foundations, so a lot of Greece's spending habits were sort of passed by the wayside, and they were waved right in. So again, things were going well for Greece. Now, once they adopted the euro, this just continued to fuel that credit binge, and the German and French banks were left holding quite a bit of that debt. So what ended up happening was, to pay them back, they ended up taking loans directly from the European Central Bank and, well, the EU taxpayer. So many countries decided that they didn't really like the idea of paying for Greece's opulent lifestyle, including early retirement ages as young as, from what I understand, 57, meaning about a quarter of their population is retired, and, you know, people in Italy and Germany and France are saying, well, if we have to work all these extra years and our pension is only, well, this, why is it that we're supplementing such great pensions over in a country that can't afford to do it themselves? So, understandably, tensions began to mount. In October 2009, things were still largely good times, but unfortunately for Greece and the rest of the world, the financial crisis was well underway. But again, the thinking was, we're in Europe, what's the worst that could happen? Unfortunately, the problem with instability in the market is it tends to drive up the cost of lending money. And when you're already so overdrawn, those interest charges being suddenly raised after the fact can become quite expensive. Help did arrive in 2010 in the form of a 110 billion euro bailout, and again, that came from the other European nations and the International Monetary Fund. So the creditors did attach some tough conditions to this as part of the law that they set out when these funds were created that said, okay, well, if we're going to lend you money, you got to abide by A, B, C. So some of those austerity measures were rather tough and unfortunately had the, well, you could call it unforeseen, but somewhat foreseeable consequence of grinding Greece's economy to a halt. At this point, being locked into the euro somewhat came back to bite Greece in the ass, as it wasn't able to devalue its own currency to pay its own people. And again, that euro maintaining its expensive rate, well, it kind of put them in a tough spot, because although cutting wages and prices is difficult and takes quite a long time, well, the euro has unfortunately stretched out this process a little bit longer than it may have needed to take had Greece remained with its own currency. The year is now 2012. The bailout is not working as intended. The second rescue basically stuck a lot of these private investors with a bit of a haircut on what it was they were supposed to get paid back, and there were some losses on the bonds. As the debt continued to mount, and the economy continued to grind to a halt, the amount of debt relative to their gross domestic product just continued to swell. So talks began for a second bailout, and interestingly, in 2012 we were in a very similar point to where we were now, where it was sort of, well, we're just going to give them more money, or are we going to impose some tougher austerity measures? Many of these austerity measures did in fact pass, but there was very lax enforcement, and again, the economy did take another dive. Although things were a little bit shaky looking, things started to look up a little bit, but unfortunately, the Greek Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Antonis Samaras, kind of pulled the plug a little bit early by declaring that they wanted to cast out these evil creditors and basically bring their bond market back into play with or without outside assistance. Agony was at an all-time high in Greece at the time, and with the turn of the new year, I think Mr. Syriza was elected to basically get everybody out of this. They were sick of the austerity, and they wanted to bring prosperity back to Greece with demands of debt reduction. And with the recent Greek vote of no, another 7.2 billion euros has slipped through the Greek government's hands, as that was really the last money on the bargaining table. So it's going to be interesting to see what plan Greece does come up with to get itself out of this predicament. I guess there's a few options. They could just go it on their own. They could try to join up with another union, perhaps China or Russia, and whatever that might imply. And unfortunately, that may just be trading one master for another, and they may just be setting themselves up for this exact same situation again. And unfortunately, there doesn't really seem to be an easy answer. They're sort of screwed whichever way they choose to look at it. There's really no more help coming in from the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe is seeing how little good their help is doing. So what do you guys think? What would be an effective solution for the Greeks at this time? Or is there no solution that you can see? Let me know in the comments. And thanks for tuning into this episode of sHreadLines.